Part 8 of the Blue Review, Volume 1, Issue Number 3, edited by John Middleton Murry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ariadne in Naxos by Edward J. Dent. Anyone who has ever attempted to learn a foreign language, anyone who has attained a considerable proficiency in it, knows that the most difficult and elusive chapter of this task is the comprehension of foreign humour. There are, of course, certain things which are comic in any language, and perhaps to any temperament. Jokes which are primitive and direct, we can all understand, and to an Englishman who knows German pretty well, there is a certain amusement to be derived from such literary humour as the parody in German of some classic German author. But supposing that we are confronted with, say, a German parody of a French or Italian author, the difficulty is horribly complicated. We may be quite familiar with the original French or Italian, we may be fluent German scholars, but there still remains a new effort to be made, and one that demands a peculiar agility of mind. We have got to realize not only what our French author signifies to us, but what he signifies to the average German mind. And we often are inclined to feel that not only is the effort irksome, but that it is not worth the trouble of making. The curious entertainment presented a month ago at His Majesty's Theatre, under the title of Ariadne in Naxos, gives unlimited scope to those who care to try psychological experiments of this kind. Ariadne in Naxos is an opera performed by order of M. Jourdain in Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme. Before we can understand Ariadne, then, we must understand M. Jourdain, not, however, Molière's M. Jourdain, or what we English people think to be Molière's M. Jourdain, but M. Jourdain, as seen by Herr von Hofmannsthal, and perhaps Herr von Hofmannsthal's M. Jourdain, as seen by Mr. Maugham and Sir Herbert Tree. Fortunately, however, this is not really the case. It is quite evident that this so-called M. Jourdain is a man of straw. What the author and composer wanted was an induction, and nothing more, that is, an apology for their opera, so as to disarm criticism by the suggestion that what was apparently serious was really meant to be comic, or vice versa. Hofmannsthal is well read in English literature, and is no doubt as familiar with the Knight of the Burning Pestle as he is with the Taming of the Shrew. It is quite possible, too, that he is acquainted with the old Italian Don Giovanni opera, which Mozart's clever librettist adapted to his own uses. Having borrowed poor M. Jourdain to serve the purpose of a Christopher Sly, the author and composer soon saw that it could be easy and effective, from the ordinary manager's point of view, to keep the most broadly comic scenes, and introduce a liberal dose of incidental music. Moreover, M. Jourdain, having held the stage both in France and in Germany for a couple of centuries, those of the audience who might be bored with the opera could at least be sure of having a good deal of fun for their money out of a tabloid arrangement of Molière. The plain fact remains, however, that in this entertainment, Molière does not count artistically at all. M. Jourdain has no more appropriateness to Strauss's opera, even as a Christopher Sly, than he would have to Fanny's first play. If an induction is wanted at all, it must be an induction of our own times. The dressing up of prologue and opera in 17th century costume and language is merely an ingenious way of escape from the difficulties which would ensue if the problem presented was taken seriously. Hofmannsthal, like a great many literary and artistic people at the present day, has fallen in love with the Baroque. We are all rather sick of Ruskin and St. Pancras Station. We are all beginning to think it rather amusing to play with ideas which our elders considered to be in bad taste, and it so happens that Hofmannsthal, by way of being original, has just discovered that the English theatre of the 17th century produced at least one immortal masterpiece, Otway's Venice Preserved. Here let me say that Hofmannsthal, as a clever German, has a real and serious advantage over us English people. He probably does not see much difference between the fine poetry and the mere bombast that are both to be found in the serious scenes, and although he can hardly appreciate the innermost flavour of the comic scenes, he at any rate has probably no scruple whatever. His version of the play is known to me only at second hand, in translating them literally, whereas in England the fantastic humours of Naki and her Antonio have been banished from the stage since the days of George II. As a matter of fact, the jumble of high tragedy and low comedy, for which Hofmannsthal so highly commends Otway, was to be found in practically every Italian opera libretto of Otway's period. Moreover, the comic episodes of the Italian operas were certainly influenced to some extent by the comedy of masks, the extemporized comedies of Harlequin and Pantaloon, which were acted at every village fair. Ariadne, then, it might be inferred, is really just a parody of 17th century Italian opera. Well, it is just such a parody as might be written by a man who had read some casual dictionary article about Italian opera and the comedy of masks, but had never given a moment's study to the very copious documents that remain, or even to the very copious literature about them. It is just possible that a clever composer, with an antiquarian turn of mind, and a keen sense of real scholarship, such as is extremely rare in Germany, might have set Hofmannsthal's Ariadne to a fairly amusing parody of old Italian music. But I cannot see that it would have been worth the trouble, given the fact that a modern audience knows nothing of the style parodical. And even if it had been worthwhile, there surely was never a composer less fitted for the task than Richard Strauss. Now, the sense of fine scholarship is by no means the first test of a really great composer. Or rather, a great composer may possess it, but does not make a parade of it, because the essential greatness of his thought and the clearness of his expression form a style of their own. On the other hand, the moment a composer wishes either to imitate or to parody some other composer's style, the sense of scholarship becomes indispensable. It is a quality which few composers of operas can afford to do without, since it is only the very greatest who can sustain the interest of an opera without recourse to local colour or some analogous device. Strauss is not one of these, in spite of all his cleverness, in spite of moments of real greatness. There is hardly a work of his which does not break down somewhere from want of scholarship. As long as Strauss is writing his own serious and strenuous style, his cacophony and even his coarseness of thought can be forgiven him. It is in his moments of would-be simplicity and popularity that he is utterly intolerable. The most horrible instance of all, perhaps, occurs in Salome, where, by way of contrast to the perversities of Herod and his court, the first followers of Jesus are represented musically by phrases which recall Franz Abt and the rest of the male voice part-song school. Der Rosenkavalier is so full of these vulgarities that there is no room for anything to set a higher standard to the listener. Ariadne is as strange a mixture as Strauss has ever produced. The incidental music to the induction might pass if Molière's play were given complete on its own merits. It is generally agreeable and occasionally amusing in a heavy-handed sort of way. It is not particularly characteristic of Strauss, and it never for a single moment bears the least resemblance to 17th century music. As a musical induction to Ariadne, it is mere waste of time. Had Sir Herbert Tree given us the entertainment all in one language, we might have had the whole of the scene which immediately precedes the opera, a scene which makes the opera a little more intelligible. It is not sufficient merely to see the horror of the composer when the order is given for the opera and the harlequinade to take place simultaneously. The offended dignity of the prima donna and the pert familiarity of Zerbinetta before the opera begins go some way to explaining their behaviours on the stage, for we are apparently meant to realise that the opera is merely an opera, and that the persons taking part in it are really live actors and actresses. It is this want of sincerity, combined with the want of scholarship, that constitutes the great blemish of the work. It is the more painfully noticeable because the concluding scene of the arrival of Bacchus and his duet with Ariadne are apparently quite sincere and undoubtedly beautiful. It is here, if anywhere, that Strauss has developed something of a new style, and a style that is free both of commonplace and of obscurity. In the earlier part of the serious opera, where Ariadne is surrounded by the Naiad, the Dryad and Echo, there are some beautiful effects, but they are studies in the technique of vocal writing rather than the inevitable expression of genuine emotion, either literary or musical. As for Zerbinetta and her crew, they are tedious in the extreme. The composer who could write a symphonic movement on Funiculi Funicula in the belief that it was a genuine folk song could hardly be expected to differentiate musically the individualities of Arlecchino, Brighella, and the rest. The ensembles of male voices suggest nothing but a German Liedertafel. The mere difficulty of Zerbinetta's great aria has made a sensation amongst those who live on sensations. But what does it amount to? It is preceded by a recitative of real power and individuality. A slow aria follows, which oscillates between sentimental melody of Strauss's usual type, when aiming at simplicity, and commonplace scales or cadenzas. After this comes the great rondo, intended apparently as a parody of Bellini, since the first phrase has a faint resemblance to "Ah, mon giunge." But Bellini, when he set out to write a tune, could at any rate keep it going. Strauss sheers off into a different style after 2 bars. The exaggerated coloratura, which forms the greater part of the rondo, is rarely expressive and seldom even effective. When it is not made up of obviously instrumental phrases, it is a mere string of threadbare tags from Meyerbeer. Of the real dramatic value of coloratura, either in comedy or tragedy, Strauss appears to know nothing whatever, and he is reputed to be a great Mozart scholar. Yet we need not be without hope. One cannot hear Ariadne in Naxos without perceiving that Strauss is at last beginning to realize, however dimly, the expressive powers of the voice. It is a new medium to him, as it must be to any modern German composer, and he will take some time before he can express himself fully in it. He is half ashamed of it at present, and afraid that the critic will laugh at him. This is why he hopes to get the laugh of them by throwing all the blame on the shoulders of poor Monsieur Jourdain. It is not, however, in Zerbinetta's aria that the conversion is apparent, not in the variations on the Rhine Maidens' songs, nor in the hymn-tune trio sung towards the end by the 3 nymphs, but in the scene of Bacchus and Ariadne, that Strauss has at last allowed his voices to be the means by which he expresses his real musical thought. It is this duet that may perhaps make Ariadne a work of real importance in the history of modern German music. End of Part 8.